the few unions that endorsed Reagan in the 1980 elections were the 13,000 members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO. Reagan had even sent a letter to the president of PATCO saying, "I pledge to you that my administration will work very closely with you." So in 1981, when PATCO went on strike to get a 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase, and better retirement benefits, they believe Reagan would be on their side. By the way, that $10,000 pay increase would be on top of the $38,000 to $50,000 per year they already made, or about $115,000 to $152,000 today. The union had just negotiated for higher pay, but rejected the Federal Aviation Administration's offer because it didn't reduce weekly hours. It was $40 million instead of the requested $600 million. Strikers cited the tremendous stress of being the lawman of the sky as one of the main reasons for needing more money.
However, Professional Airways System Specialist Union President Larry Henry charges the equipment in the radar room is not being maintained properly.
The main problem? Their standing as federal employees prohibited them from striking. Plus, people thought they already made enough money. On August 3rd, 1981, PATCO declared a strike anyways. Reagan replied by giving them 48 hours to return to work or be fired, with the additional kicker of never being able to be rehired by the government again. 1,300 union members broke the strike and returned to work.
I would like to thank the supervisors and controllers who are on the job today, helping to get the nation's air system operating safely. In the New York area, for example, 4 supervisors were scheduled to report for work, and 17 additionally volunteered. At National Airport, a traffic controller told a news person he had resigned from the union and reported to work because, quote, "How can I ask my kids to obey the law if I don't?"
Before firing them, Reagan called the demands of the remaining striking PATCO members an unfair tax burden to fellow citizens, ironically mentioning that he respected the right of workers in the private sector to strike, while he and his administration fought tirelessly to deregulate businesses so they could in fact crush unions in the private sector. PATCO's failed strike and Reagan's response signaled that union power was a thing of the past. Contemporary polls showed the general public approving of Reagan's choice, with over 50% of respondents agreeing with his choice. Reported the Pew Research Center. Just 28% said air traffic controllers should be permitted to strike, while 68% said they should not. Even among those in households with a union member, just 40% said the controllers should be allowed to strike. Shortly after firing the PATCO workers, Reagan defended his budget and tax cuts to the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, telling him that his spending cuts were hardly cruel and inhuman deprivation. There was no applause for this statement. So what about these budget cuts? At the dawn of the 80s, there was a huge deficit, something that would increase throughout Reagan's presidency, peaking at $200 billion. No president had balanced the budget in 12 years. Reagan wanted to cut federal spending, and therefore the budget, by approximately $48 billion. Spending for programs like Medicare and Social Security were 48% of the budget, while military defense spending was over 25%. As made clear in episode 1, Reagan's nosy and destructive foreign policy was his main priority. National debt composed another 10% of the budget, meaning roughly 80% of the budget was impossible to cut. So, budget cuts were reserved for smaller, Great Society programs that benefited the poor and minorities.
Over 90% of black students, those who attend black institutions as well as those who attend predominantly white institutions, depend upon federal assistance. Over 90%. So any cutback in funding for grants and student loan programs or whatever will be devastating.
Reagan signed his budget package in March 1981. The slightly altered version of the budget plans cut spending by $35 billion and was adopted by Congress in May. Along with cutting funds for the child nutrition program, the budget cut funding for Medicaid, student aid, small business loans, and veteran benefits. These programs were popular among wide swaths of Americans, and though Americans hated paying taxes, they loved the programs that the taxes provided. Kevin Phillips pointed out that Americans are hostile to the rich and to big businesses at the same time as they dislike minorities and the liberal politicians who seem to favor minority interests over the working class. Reaganomics prioritized new federalism, or shifting social service responsibility to the state level, and privatization, or less government spending by shifting services to the for-profit private sector. But Phillips warned that liberalism, or belief in big government social programs, was still a pernicious threat to conservative goals of new federalism and privatization. Meanwhile, Reagan's main domestic priority was getting Congress to approve of supply-side economics, in which he claimed tax cuts for the wealthy would benefit society with investments and spending that would trickle down to the lower class. Reagan used an anecdote from his Hollywood days, saying, "When I was in the movies, I'd reach a point each year where after the second movie, I'd be in the 90% bracket, so I just wouldn't make any more movies that year." And it wasn't just me, but Bogert and Gable and others did the same. We weren't the ones who were hurt. The people who worked the props and the people who worked the yard, they were the ones who were hurt. Reaganomics believers insisted there was a war against the rich and that they needed to be catered to and encouraged to invest to fix the economy and poverty and all that other shit. Hence the push for a lower tax rate on personal income and capital gains. To get the tax cuts passed, Reagan would need the support of the public as well as 47 conservative Southern Democrats like Phil Gramm in the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. David Stockman, the newly appointed director of the Office of Management and Budget, informed Congressmen on his plan to starve the beast. This starve the beast strategy had been conceived of by Irving Kristol, the father of neoconservatism, who proposed slashing taxes and then reimposing fiscal discipline on Democratic administrations who would have to tidy up afterward. Along with corporate lobbyists and new right activists like Milton Friedman, the pressure to pass the Economic Recovery Tax Act was on. Friedman, who since the 60s had been publishing stingy economic theories based on personal achievement, published the best-selling Free to Choose with his wife Rose in 1980. PBS even aired a 10-part television series based on the book, showing that conservative economic values were being shown to and accepted by mainstream Americans, even those who grew up benefiting from New Deal and Great Society programs. Free to Choose promoted the free market, bemoaned welfare, and advocated for school vouchers. You know, the usual. Individual advancement and personal achievement were key components of getting people to accept the budget and tax cuts, phrases people used when they complained about blacks and immigrants getting their share of economic relief. Conservative and moderate Democrats were further pressured to approve of Reagan's tax cuts after an infamous assassination attempt by John Hinckley Jr. in a deranged attempt to woo the affections of teenage actress Jodi Foster.
He was wounded. My God. The president was hit. He is in stable condition. All this information, the president was hit.
Just 70 days into term, Reagan came within 2 minutes of dying at the hospital due to blood loss, and 2 staff members and a cop were also shot and injured. Press Secretary James Brady was permanently disabled as a result. It's worth noting that it had only been 18 years since the assassination of the last president, a memory that for many patriotic Americans was still fresh. The White House played up Reagan's hospital bed charm, where he asked all the medical personnel before surgery if they were all Republicans. It cannot be overstated how much the assassination attempt would serve to mitigate criticisms of Reagan's choices throughout the rest of the decade. What happened to Reagan on Monday is the stuff of which legends are made, wrote David Broder for the Washington Post. Before the shooting, Reagan had 74% approval from Republicans, 38% approval from Democrats, and 53% approval from independents. After the shooting, Reagan had 92% Republican approval, 51% Democrat approval, and 70% independent approval. After weeks of recovery that still included work and photo ops, Reagan was welcomed back by Congress with a 3-minute standing ovation at the end of April. The tax recovery bill sailed through the House in May and passed in the Senate in late July with the support of hella Democrats breaking ranks, including one guy named Joe Biden. Reagan signed the bill into law in August. The Omnibus Reconciliation Act also cut federal income and business taxes by 25%, just 5% shy of the 30% that Reagan originally asked for. Capital gains taxes were also cut, making investments more appealing to the wealthy. And for the lower class, the Washington Post detailed, the scope of the changes is reflected in the following rough administration and congressional estimates. In the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, the Basic Welfare program, 400,836 families will be cut off the rolls, and another 528,000 will have benefits reduced. In the food stamp program, 875,000 families will be dropped from the program, and 1.4 million households, or 5 million people, will have benefits reduced. But it's okay, right? Shit would trickle down, right? In 1981, 35 states had a stock of 500 million total pounds of subsidized cheese and other dairy products. After a 1977 Carter policy invested $2 billion in the dairy industry within 4 years, dairy farmers overproduced because the government purchased what farmers couldn't sell and turned it into butter, cheese, and dehydrated milk powder. But in 1981, a lot of it was beginning to go bad. After many public complaints that the cheese should go to the needy, Reagan established the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program to give out 30 million pounds to the elderly and low income, with California being the first state to receive cheese from the surplus. Government cheese itself had been around since the World War II era, but 1981 was the first year it was directly given away for free. The first giveaways were often late and usually moldy. Eventually, 300 million pounds were given out. To qualify, a family of 4 had to earn under $15,630 a year. Single people living on less than $7,970 a year also could get a slice. But as Vice put it, 75% of African Americans, 51% of Latinos, and 80% of Asian Americans are lactose intolerant versus the 21% of Caucasians. And because minorities historically have been heavily represented in welfare programs, the government wasn't really doing Americans' butts a favor. People took what they could get though. Why were so many people making such meager amounts?
Tonight on Frontline, a generation of American children is being raised in poverty.
Do you have any money at all today? None at all.
1 out of 4 children in this country is poor. They are sick.
This baby has been home for more than 2 weeks. He has developed an infection.
They are hungry.
Do you have other food in the house?
They need more help than the government can give. What future do they have? Tonight, growing up poor.
In the Midwest and South, American farmers were feeling the burn. The state of Minnesota alone lost over 10,000 farms. For starters, farm debt had doubled to $215 billion in 1984, caused by high production numbers and faltering foreign exports. Improved food production and technology via the Green Revolution in India and other countries across the world meant more competition for American farmers. In 1980, a trade embargo enacted by Jimmy Carter against the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan caused a backup of exports. Farmers were angry with Reagan, who implied on the campaign trail that he would lift the embargo when elected. Farmers who already owed massive piles of debt were crushed by the recession impacting everyone else. New policies by the Federal Reserve caused farmland value to drop 60% in some parts of the Midwest between 1981 and 1985. On top of all of that, there were 2 terrible droughts in 1983 and 88. There were tons of farm foreclosures, and local populations began to migrate as agricultural towns closed factories, businesses, and banks. Government services in these areas dropped and schools closed. The misfortune spread to cities where farm supply manufacturers laid off workers. To put it in terms of a human toll, over 900 farmers died by suicide in the Midwest during the 1980s. 2 bankers were even murdered by a father-son team in 1983 when they realized their farm was going under. In 85, the Farm Aid Annual Benefit Concert was established by Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young, where they and other music stars performed before a crowd of 80,000 in Illinois.
Now, live for Farm Aid and a concert for America, here's Willie Nelson.
In In '86, Congress passed the Family Farmer Bankruptcy Act, which helped reduce debt and interest rates to keep families on farms. In '87, Reagan lifted the grain embargo against the Soviet Union, sending exports back up. Farmland values were also creeping back up and farming technology was improving. The crisis would ease by the end of the decade, but the agricultural industry was forever changed. The changes in various industries were apparent and impacting everyone at all levels. In 1983, the New York Times reported the sullen hopes of some college graduates, writing that more than 900,000 of them have discovered they must put aside college days dreams and settle for jobs that do not require a degree if they want to work at all. After a sharp rise of computer science degrees and jobs in the late 70s, the job availability peaked in 1984 and would continue to decline for the next 10 years. For the blue-collar workers, many of the remaining factories were modernizing and thinning their workforces. Noted experts in 1984, previously in a more stable competitive environment, U.S. manufacturing companies would lay off workers with the least seniority in a downturn and reemploy them when economic conditions improved. Now, companies were much more likely to shutter whole plants. The industry doing the most hiring was suddenly service, including retail store associates, restaurant staff, and non-medical staff in hospitals and nursing facilities for the growing elderly population. These were jobs where union power was nil and the wages were abominable. By 1990, just over 3/4 of all jobs were in the service sector, especially in malls and fast food.
Working the grill, Bill, it ain't so tough. But first of all, you got to check your stuff. Like a grill that's set at 250 with the meat and cheese that's ready to go. A towel to keep your station looking cool. But most of all, you got to have your tool. Are you with me now? Get ready. We're gonna lay them down. Now, beats got grain to it just like wood. You got to follow the arrow to lay it down like you should. From the front to the back, you got to lay it down. Space it evenly, not scattered around. Next, you got to salt the meat from the back to the front to make the taste complete. Not too little, not too much. With a little finesse, you'll get the touch.
Interestingly, the fastest growing segment of the retail trade were radio, TV, and music stores. Contrary to the popular belief that everyone who was on welfare or desired it were lazy freeloaders who didn't want to work, the decision to work for pennies in service and potentially being ineligible for welfare that you definitely needed was not an easy one. A 1984 profile described a working mother's plight thusly. She loses both the welfare and Medicaid coverage if she and her son keep their jobs. If she chooses to quit her job, she would qualify for a $516 monthly welfare payment, an amount roughly equal to or exceeding her family's actual take-home income after expenses. Or her son could quit work and the family would qualify for a smaller welfare payment. With the welfare payment, however, would come a return to the Medicaid program with full medical coverage and eligibility to receive up to $250 in food stamp benefits. By any strict accounting standard, it is to her advantage to quit work and go on welfare, a choice she does not, in fact, intend to make. Something that often goes undiscussed is how the 1981 budget restricted welfare eligibility, setting asset limits for needy families at $1,000. This means that saving more than $1,000 made you ineligible for welfare, even though $1,000 was not enough to live off or invest on. Unsurprisingly, people receiving welfare would blow through their savings instead of stacking up substantial amounts of cash. And yes, this problem continued long after Reagan left office. The hard choices that poor Americans would have to make took place among a backdrop of ableism, racism, and misogyny, and threading all of these things together, classism and a hatred of the poor. In 1980, an asshole named Bob Johnson published the Public Assistance Board Game, the tagline being, "Why work for a living?" The Baltimore Sun described that the welfare recipient starts off with $500 and gets more for each illegitimate child. The working person starts off with a $150 paycheck. The welfare recipient tries to stay out of work. The working person tries to keep out of the poorhouse. It further summarized, board spaces offer instructions such as hit sub shop, collect $50, and special sexual favor for police chief, collect $300. Others suggest lie on job application, buy a case of wine, and snowstorm immobilizes police, loot $2,000. The game brought the outrage of the NAACP, National Organization for Women, and other groups, making many stores stop selling it, but not before 135,000 copies of the board game were purchased. While his administration grappled with a $100 million deficit, Reagan targeted welfare as a system rife with waste and fraud. During a meeting with senators, he told a blatantly fictional tale about a young man going into a grocery store and buying an orange with a food stamp and taking the change from the stamp to buy vodka. Change from food stamp purchases were no more than 99 cents, and it wasn't even possible to buy a bottle of vodka with 99 cents, assuming the orange was like a penny. This is one of the many instances in politics where welfare, like many things, was not discussed honestly. Instead of discussing wages not keeping up with cost of living, welfare recipients were stereotyped as lazy Americans who just needed to work.
I think a lot of our families don't stress education starting from the very young. There are no role models for the children to see. They see their parents receiving welfare checks. They don't see their children. They don't see their parents going out every morning to a job and bringing in a paycheck to pay for their various needs. So therefore they feel, well, if my mother can feed 7 children and we're not doing that bad, we're still living, well, why should I go out and get an education, finish school, and try to look for a job?
In the decades prior, Chester had been at the center of racist corruption scandals that left residents, predominantly black, in dire straits. In the 80s, Chester was one of many deindustrialized towns reeling from few job opportunities, dwindling public resources, and environmental racism in addition to crime. The city had even erected a toxic trash incinerator and a sewage plant in a prison.
Kids is something like that, I might sell drugs for a while, pay them, make a good 10 grand, put it in the bank, right, and all that. Put the money in the bank, and I think that lasts me much good to pay the rent, feed my children for a while. If I have to sell drugs to survive, I don't have to do it.
It's wrong selling drugs because it's against the law, but I still do it anyway because I want to. And because nobody can stop me out in the street from selling drugs except the cops if I get caught.
Of course, all of this generational and systemic context was missing from the documentary. The coded language about welfare was directed towards black Americans, especially due to the haunting specter of the racist welfare queen stereotype. By 1987, the black unemployment rate was double that of whites. Black people were often among the first to lose their jobs when factories or businesses shuttered. But there's more. Because Reagan cut aid to cities and cities returning towards the private sector, cities cut their budgets and had massive layoffs. Many of the affected jobs were held by black people, who held a large proportion of municipal jobs. These issues and a bunch of other stuff we'll get into in the next episode were rarely addressed when the welfare problem was discussed. Instead, poverty was presented as a personal moral issue made worse by bleeding heart liberals. In 1984, Charles Murray, white supremacist economist and member of conservative think tank the Manhattan Institute, published Losing Ground, a scathing bestseller that emphasized that welfare, soft approaches to crime, and changes to education were creating incentives to fail. 40 states would set up welfare-to-work programs throughout the decade, and the Family Support Act of 1988 took this to a national level, directing states to implement education and job training and placement programs by 1990. The effectiveness of these programs would be dubious.